Thanks very much, Lynn, and thanks to Pathways to Prosperity. Really pleased to be here for this afternoon's panel. I think we're going to have a good discussion that's going to tie in a number of the themes that we've heard over the last couple of days, and I think build a little bit on yesterday's opening panel. It was really engaging around politicization, so I think we're a good bookend to two really productive days. So in my presentation, I'm going to speak on sort of three broad challenges that we have observed in Canada's settlement system, and how IRCC is looking to address each of those challenges with partners. So I'm going to look at some of the changing settlement patterns in terms of movements to non-traditional communities, some smaller urban centers, look at some of the changing settlement needs of newcomers, more complex needs, and as well some of those emerging challenges around with increased irregular migration and some of the public support. So those are sort of the three pieces I'm going to touch on. Beginning, Canada really has been an immigration net receiving country since its inception. So really that cultural diversity really being a defining feature of Canadian society. Our managed migration approach is really an envy. It's seen as a real best practice. And so there really continues to be broad public support for immigration. I've highlighted our program evaluation that really has a sound basis for programming. So I think we really have a good foundation and infrastructure in place in terms of supporting and welcoming newcomers. And that's important as we look to increasing immigration levels over the coming period. And it's a key priority for the government, and so it really allows us some more longer-term planning and certainty. So it presents us challenges with the increased immigration, but as well real opportunities for greater readiness and planning moving forward. And some of those changing settlement patterns, I was just highlighting here how historically newcomers have overwhelmingly settled in the most populous provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. And while that continues to be the majority situation, there are trends shifting towards other settlement patterns. This pie chart showing that in 97, about 90% of economic immigrants were going to those three provinces, and 20 years later, it's about 2/3. This is just another depiction of the same piece. It's really highlighting sort of increased settlement in prairie provinces as well as in the Atlantic provinces. Also, if you look more closely at the community level, while Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, still places of residence for more than half of immigrants, there are some patterns of shifting settlement to smaller urban centers. And so looking at 2016 census data showing that Regina, Winnipeg, Calgary, Saskatoon, Edmonton, so all receiving shares of recent newcomers that are almost twice the size of each of those communities' share of their total population in Canada. So if you were kind of difficult to see, but if you look at Winnipeg, for example, about 4.3% of all new immigrants settled in Winnipeg, and while only about 2.2% of all Canadians live in that central census metropolitan area. But despite those some of those changing patterns to non-traditional communities, Canadians' experiences with immigration really do differ vastly across the country. So Canada's largest urban centres have some of the highest proportions of immigrant populations in the world, whereas some of the more smaller centres or rural and remote communities remain overwhelmingly populated by non-immigrants. And so just shows a couple examples using a bit of alliteration from Sackville, New Brunswick to Surrey, BC. From Toronto to Truro, and really seeing where there's smaller communities where overwhelmingly non-immigrant and with some larger urban centers being much more diverse. And so within that broad context, we're increasingly seeing provinces and territories, regions, communities of all sizes are looking at immigration in terms of how it can support labor market growth, skills development, addressing demographic challenges, and really vibrancy. But at the same time, there's lots of challenges around retention, secondary migration, and so I want to speak to some initiatives that are underway in terms of looking at some of those issues around retention. And the first one I'd highlight is the Atlantic Immigration Pilot. I know there was a workshop earlier in the session, and so this is one initiative that the government's working very closely with provincial governments on. It's really focused primarily on that retention issue, and really testing, having employers more directly involved in the selection of candidates, and then really having a direct relationship with service provider organizations to provide those real connections and having those comprehensive settlement supports. A unique feature is 100% of those individuals coming in on that stream will have had a settlement needs assessment and those linkages to services. So we'll be watching that initiative really closely to see what the outcomes are. There's a existing sort of reference group that meets regularly of employers and service providers and governments, really monitoring ongoing, and there'll be a comprehensive evaluation. So we'll be really looking closely at seeing what are the outcomes and how those can be translated to other communities and supports. And in terms of that, looking at those policy directions, there's lots of interest within the department in looking at rural immigration. Where can there be opportunities to learn from the Atlantic Immigration Pilot? What are the success factors that maybe can be translated to other centers in terms of focusing on retention and challenges without migration and attraction as well? I'd highlight in terms of another core feature of community support and the settlement program around local immigration partnerships. I know there was a gathering earlier in this week, and really just having the importance of those community-based enablers for knowledge sharing, for strategic planning, for coordination, and highlighting at the bottom of the slide how our evaluation is really pointing to the success of that model, and really wanting to be able to use it strategically to ensure there's really successful supports to those organizations, that we're getting the information back in terms of supporting programming and planning and helping those cross connections as well. I'd also highlight Francophone immigration in terms of that community perspective and the work that the department is doing in terms of funding from the Action Plan for Official Languages. And in terms of what I'd highlight is welcoming Francophone communities work in terms of supporting targeted communities in creating an environment in which French-speaking newcomers will really feel welcome and enhance their capacity to integrate and retain French-speaking newcomers. So this is another pilot that we're looking at. It's an opportunity to test community-based funding. There will be partnerships where communities will be able to identify and implement projects by Francophones for Francophones to address those local needs that have been identified through a community-based approach. So again, another initiative that we'll be looking at very closely in terms of learnings, in terms of how it can be scaled and used more strategically. Moving a little bit to some of those changing settlement needs of clients, I would highlight, as everyone is well aware, about the Syrian refugee movement, and with the increased levels plan, there will be, again, receiving more refugees over time, not at those historic levels of the Syrian initiative. But there's also other government initiatives around welcoming the Yazidi population recently, as well as another budget commitment, 2018, about an additional 1,000 vulnerable women and girls. So there's a key focus for the government, and so we're seeing increasingly a range of needs. And so mental health issues have emerging increasingly. issues around service providers and staff and ensuring their wellness and supports in terms of working with those populations. And so I'd say largely we're seeing a lot of in our consultation work hearing about the needs of serving a diverse group of populations, from mental health issues, LGBTQ, women, youth at risk, seniors, and so really being able to have tailored projects to needs, and so really being able to have more of a client-based approach in terms of supporting clients. This next slide I put in there in terms of just, again, looking at where there may be needs and service needs and the ability to address those. And so the main thing I wanted to highlight here is that during the Syrian initiative, the Atlantic region really welcomed Syrians at above their rate of the national average. And so I think we're seeing early signs, monitoring that closely. Retention rates have been quite high, but it's also important in terms of our thinking about availability of services and agencies and where clients are and being able to support smaller centers. I'm gonna pass that one. So in terms of some of those increasing client needs, I was going to highlight a little bit some of the work that's underway in terms of addressing some of those challenges, informing it. We've had an initiative which we call the Settlement Design Challenge, which was really, again, looking at client-informed and client-centered care. And this was an initiative where staff worked with OCAD University and went out and really talked very much to clients, to service providers, to all partners in the system to really understand what's holding people back and what helps them move forward, and really to sort of get a real basis from a user perspective in terms of supporting program development. Visible Minority Newcomer Pilot, that's an initiative that the government announced in the last budget, where we're really going to be putting in place a robust test to really try to understand the interventions that really support labor market attachment and laddering up for that group. So we'll be doing some engagement over the coming weeks and really trying to put in a robust model to learn from that. Youth as well, a key issue, lots of concerns of youth at risk. We'll be putting in place a youth advisory group of a cohort of dynamic individuals who will have lived experience with immigration and settlement services to really give that guidance and lens, sort of building off a bit of the Prime Minister's Youth Council, but with a real immigration department focus. And lastly, CFP 2019, our big funding call that will be coming in the new year, and there's been lots of engagement throughout the last months in terms of forming that. And again, the emphasis on client-informed and client-centered supports has been really the dominant theme that we've heard. Finally, I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the challenges around public support. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, that overall public support remains very high, but we're mindful of different pressures, public opinion, where there may be some softness and challenges. And I know that in some of the polling we do, the Canadians really see support for immigration positively. It's impacting the country really well at a national level, but they don't always see that at the local community level. They don't necessarily see it in their next door and at that local level. So what does that mean for us in terms of those supports and how we move forward? And I'd highlight the Immigration Matters campaign. I think Naomi alluded to it yesterday, but it's really a concerted effort in terms of communicating the immigration's continued benefits to Canadians and looking at it from a national and a local level. The campaign launched a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of political leadership around that, and it's really based on storytelling and facts. And really to try to dispel some of those common myths about immigrants and refugees, and really to have some positive engagement. And so it's based on a series of communities, and this one just as an example of Windsor, but there's many communities there, and that's a piece that we'll be continuing to build and sort of having an energized dialogue in that area. And I'd give a bit of a shout out to any New Brunswick colleagues here that are here, because there's lots of other people that are stepping forward and having these conversations, the New Brunswick Conversation Circle tool, where they really went into small communities and engaged on the challenges in those small communities and what the demographics looked like and the importance of immigration. And so there was some real leadership there, and that the department saw some real strength in that and is following suit. So I'm going to leave it there, and I have 42 seconds left. Wow. Okay.